we are continuing to remove some of the paywalls and update some of the content for this, the second year of Phroneo. Please enjoy this post originally published here a year ago and share it with your friends and relations. Ex post facto. A few days ago, I received an interesting email in the post from a mailing list on which I happened to find myself. The curators of the newsletter pose a practical question to several bishops or priests and then share the answers. It is usually short, not particularly profound, and very informative. I think that the idea is wonderful and can be quite useful. In this mailing, the topic was the prayer rule before communion, more specifically, whether a priest could still serve the liturgy if he failed to complete the prayer rule before communion. The answers of senior priests offered in the newsletter were insightful, as they usually are, but that is not what drew my attention. Of particular interest to me was the appellation to a 17th century text often included in the back of Slavonic editions of the service book. The text clearly indicates that the rule contained in it is of general applicability to priests, deacons, or anyone else, and in my experience, the question of prayers before communion is indeed of concern to many clergy and laity alike. Here is the text in the translation provided by the newsletter. If a priest, deacon, or anyone else deliberately neglects the prescribed church rule and the proper preparation for communion, whether partially or completely out of laziness or neglect, they commit a mortal sin. However, if a priest is engaged in other spiritual duties, such as hearing confessions or administering sacraments, and lacks time to fully complete the preparations before the divine liturgy, it is not considered a sin. In such a scenario, it is advised that clergymen complete the remaining part of the rule after the service, provided they can still offer prayers for communion before the liturgy. The emphasis was provided by the editor of the newsletter and is absent in the original text. It is not clear why the editor chose to emphasize those particular parts, but this speaks more about the sensibilities of the editor rather than about the consensus of the Church. The excerpt as provided here is somewhat incomprehensible. Let us take a closer look at the context of this selection, the history of the pre-communion prayers, and the implication of completing the remaining part of the rule after the service. First, the prescribed church rule mentioned in the excerpt above is not what most laymen and clergy understand to be the prayers before communion. From the larger context which precedes the provided excerpt, the rule can be identified as consisting of the compline, prayers before sleep, self-selected canons, and acathists, all on the eve before communion, then early in the morning, before dawn, the midnight office, followed by matins, first, third, sixth hours, and the ninth hour when it is sung, depending on the time. This is the actual church rule, as defined by the text, and which it is a mortal sin to neglect out of laziness. If we interpret this instruction with respect to the typical set of services at a typical Russian parish, at the very least, this means the vigil on Saturday or the eve of a feast, first hour, prayers before sleep, a self-selected canon, or acathist, and then presumably morning prayers in place of the midnight office, then third and sixth hours, and liturgy. The issue of laziness and neglect is much more difficult to discern. I do not believe that self-identifying as lazy makes one such, As we discussed in a previous post, I have not noticed too many people who confess not praying enough, being lazy and neglectful about their spiritual lives. This is not to say that there are no lazy and neglectful people, but those usually neither come to church nor confess a lack of prayer. Typically, pastors work with people who do come to church, who do come to confession, who clean, cook, donate, sing, bring their children to Sunday school, help others, and all of that, in addition to raising those children while working a full-time job and attempting to manage a relationship with a spouse. These are not lazy people. Suggesting to them that they should wake up 15 minutes earlier in order to fit in morning prayers or the midnight office is not very helpful when they only get 5 or 6 hours of sleep per night. We are not free. The standard of neglect may be easier to apply to clergy whose very lifestyle, theoretically, should be focused on the cycles of divine services. But many priests and most deacons work outside the church, and it is thus unreasonable to expect them to adhere to a rule which does not take this reality into account. Present-day difficulties aside, the actual rule that most people understand to be the prayer rule before communion is mentioned in the excerpt above only in the very last clause, provided they can still offer prayers for communion before the liturgy. In other words, while the daily cycle of services, if it was not completed before the liturgy for some good cause, could be completed after the liturgy, the actual prayers before communion must be completed prior to the liturgy, at least according to this 17th century text. This document, which is titled Izvestia Uchitelne, Instructional Information, was composed in the 17th century and based on Roman Catholic sources reworked in Western Ukraine. The Catholic origins of the instructional information are not in and of themselves unique or objectionable. The two traditions were very close and had to address similar issues in practical liturgics. And yet, the Holy Synod of the Russian Church resolved not to include this document in the 1723 edition of the service book, after finding some of the instructions doubtful and very unfitting, and determining that the text would have to be reworked if it were to be used in future editions. Apparently, no one was actually tasked with reworking the document, and starting with the 1734 edition of the service book, the instructions began to be printed without any changes and without the explicit approval of the Synod. The same text, without any changes, continues to be printed today. This is not to say that the practice of saying prayers before communion originates with the document printed in the back of the Russian service book. It does not. However, the prayer rule in the format that exists today, as well as the morning and evening prayer rules in their present formats, all appear to be influenced by Roman Catholic practice and entered Russian Orthodoxy through Western Ukraine and the labors of the Kiev Metropolitan Peter Mohila, Petro Mohila. It is important to note that Mohila was the Metropolitan of Kiev from 1633 to 1646, during the time that Kiev was a part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The tradition of reciting extra-liturgical prayers before communion has existed in Orthodoxy since at least the 4th century. For over a millennium since then, some people chose to add various prayers while waiting to receive communion, perhaps within festivities celebrated in liturgical formats we no longer use, or while in a long line to the chalice. Eventually, this practice was regularized to some degree in monasteries in the Middle Ages, but it remained very short compared to our present-day versions, one or two or perhaps three prayers while approaching the chalice was the norm. The closest echo to that ancient practice, and perhaps the most historically authentic, is the common recitation of one prayer immediately before communion in many parishes today. I believe, O Lord, and I confess. The work of compiling the various extant prayers into one rule, thus greatly expanding it, making it no longer practical to use during the liturgy, and forcing it to be recited privately prior to the service, was not completed until the 17th century, and the practice persists today. This expanded and regularized rule became an additional paraliturgical component of the monastic prayer rule, and from there it was adopted by both clergy and laity outside of monastic orders. And while in monasteries prayer rules are prescribed by the constitutions of the specific monastery or by a monk's spiritual father, it is far less clear just by what mechanism laity could be obligated to recite the specific prayer rule that is printed in whatever edition of the prayer book as a necessary condition of being allowed to partake of the body and blood of Christ. In Moscow Patriarchate, there exists a document approved by a meeting of bishops in February of 2015, which states that an unchanging part of a prayerful preparation for communion is the prayer rule, consisting of the appropriate canon and prayers. Noted, but this document serves more as a pastoral advisory than a basis for excommunication of those who failed to follow its precepts. To be sure, prayers before communion are pious and beneficial to one's spiritual state, and this is why some of these prayers have been used by the faithful for many centuries. Parish clergy should encourage their flocks to devote time to prayer in preparation for receiving the sacraments. Even more importantly, people should encourage themselves and prepare for communion through prayer, fasting, attending services, reconciling with everyone around them. But it is not self-evident to me that erroneously implying that failing to follow a monastic prayer rule is a mortal sin for non-monastics is helpful or appropriate. Of course, those under holy orders, albeit non-monastics, should be expected, at the very least, to prepare for their service to the sacrament by completing the prayer rule, as well as to be skillful enough in such matters as to determine what the appropriate rule is for them. Perhaps by taking the monastic rule as the basis. But should one fail to complete it on occasion, must it then be completed after the liturgy? This last question is deserving of some special attention, as it requires the consideration of the place of the preparatory action, such as prayers, in the context of the sacrament of communion. Whether it is the daily cycle of services that would have to be completed after the liturgy, as the instructions in the service book state, or the private prayer rule, as the editor of the newsletter that I received seems to mistakenly suggest, the principle remains the same. To illustrate this, it may be helpful to use a reductio ad absurdum image. Envision a general whose soldiers failed to properly clean their rifles before a battle, and so immediately after their victory over the enemy, he orders them to finish cleaning their rifles. A useful activity to be sure, but the timing seems a bit off. Or imagine that a Christian, whether out of laziness or out of neglect, I cannot tell, God knoweth. Imagine that this Christian failed to attend the Matin service of the great and holy Saturday of the Passion Week. Would it then be fitting to finish reading the Lamentations on the day of Pascha after the Divine Liturgy? What precisely would be the purpose of such an exercise? What would one hope to accomplish? And is not every Eucharist a small Pascha? Are the words of John Chrysostom not eternally, but only conditionally true? And he shows mercy upon the last, and cares for the first. And to the one he gives, and upon the other he bestows gifts. And he both accepts the deeds, and welcomes the intention, and honors the acts, and praises the offering. Wherefore, enter you all into the joy of your Lord, and receive your reward, both the first, and likewise the second. You rich and poor together, hold high festival. You sober, and you heedless, honor the day. Rejoice today, both you who have fasted and you who have disregarded the fast. The table is full laden, feast ye all sumptuously. The calf is fatted, let no one go hungry away. Is he not the same God? Is the fatted calf not the same? Are the people different? I do not know whether the prayer rule as it exists today is an unchanging part of a prayerful preparation for communion, as the Russian synodal document claims, but what is indeed unchanging is the orthodox trend toward greater volume and complexity over time. From the simple Sunday Eucharist of the early Church, we have now developed not only the daily and yearly cycles of services, but also the 512-year Great Indiction, which incorporates the solar and lunar calendars. See our previous post. As human history persists, we continue to add memorials for saints and events, celebrations and commemorations, as well as fasting periods. Fasting in the early Church was limited to only a few days at a time. Nowadays, if we were to count only the 4 major fasts, in addition to Wednesdays and Fridays, fasting has spread to at least 2/3 of the entire year. Perhaps this is a good thing, but perhaps human nature begins to get in the way of spiritual progress. As psychologists have noticed quite some time ago, more posters and announcements do not create greater awareness, and more rules do not produce greater compliance. There exists a point of oversaturation. Adding more and more fasting days seems to lead not to more fasting, but to more dieting, and this is in the best-case scenarios. In many cases, even the dieting gets reduced to just the first and last weeks of a major fast, or even to just the last week. Add in more services to the daily cycle, the rules, the hours, the inter-hours, etc., does not necessarily lead to more time spent in prayer as much as to more laziness and neglect. Likewise, adding more prayers to various rules may not be of much spiritual benefit after a certain point. It may be reasonable to expect that many good Christians would be moved in their spirit to say a prayer before approaching the chalice, as many have for more than a millennium. But creating an additional 45-minute-long paraliturgical service, and then adding to it 3 canons and an akathist, this may be a burden that, even when actually borne out of obedience, may be of dubious prayerful benefit. There will always be some people who receive a gift from God that inspires them to fast, as did the Venerable Hilarion of the Kiev caves, or to keep vigil and remain in prayer day and night, or to add 4 more canons and 2 akathists to the prescribed rule. And such people thrive spiritually when they espouse a monastic lifestyle, whether in a monastery or in the world. But there are also many others who have other gifts and talents, and it is perhaps not appropriate to rhetorically bully them by suggesting that they are in a state of mortal sin, or that they are lazy and neglectful if they do not keep a monastic rule. It has now been 3 centuries since the Holy Synod has resolved that some doubtful and very unfitting instructions should be reworked. Perhaps the new edition could finally reconsider unfitting appellations to the Catholic concept of mortal sin, or the doubtful suggestion that the required opera must be performed, even if ex post facto, in order for the sacrament to be operato. If you enjoy Phroneo, please share it with your friends and relations, and please consider becoming a paying subscriber. It is only $50 per year, and you will receive full access to all of our posts ex post facto.